Hello there, welcome back. Our topic for this lesson is abundant manna. We've been talking about this word manna for a while, but unless you were with us for the Old Testament that we covered last year, this word manna might be not quite as familiar and you're just catching on to it. So we're going to go more in depth into what manna is. Now manna comes from the story of the Passover and the Hebrew people leaving slavery in Egypt and traveling to the Promised Land. Manna was the food that the Hebrew people, the people of Israel, collected to eat each morning when they were wandering in the desert for 40 years. After they left Egypt and Pharaoh let them go, they crossed through the Red Sea and they got into the desert to head to the Promised Land. Moses went up the mountain to go get the 10 Commandments from God, and the Hebrew people got tired of waiting, so they created a golden calf and worshipped it. This angered God, and so God punished them with 40 years of wandering in the desert. But while they were wandering in the desert, God still provided for them. And one of the things that God provided for the Hebrew people, the people of Israel, as they wandered the desert, was this manna. The manna would fall from heaven every morning. The people were instructed to go and collect their manna for the day. That would be their food and their sustenance to get them through the day. Now, there were some rules with the manna. You couldn't collect more than what you needed for just one day, because if you collected enough to store up and hoard, then you were keeping more than your fair share and it would rot by the next day. And also, God still let them have a Sabbath rest. So the day before the Sabbath, they were allowed to collect 2 days worth of manna, so that on the Sabbath, they didn't have to go through the work of collecting the manna. Here, we are talking about abundant manna. Now, no longer is manna falling from the sky like it was when the Hebrew people were wandering the desert, but manna is this word that we're using to refer to all food, but also all basic necessities, the things that we need in our day-to-day life to survive, to live, and to thrive. All of these things that we're talking about are possessions, things, money, food, clothing, housing, shoes, all the possessions that we might need to have a good and thriving life. So when we're talking about abundant manna in this part of our chapter, we're talking about all the ways that Jesus is teaching the disciples and providing for people who are in need of some of their basic things, like the story of the feeding of the 5,000 people. 5,000 people or more had gathered to hear Jesus speak, but there was no food in sight. So Jesus found food in 2 loaves of bread and 5 fish, and fed 5,000 to 15,000 people with that pile of food. Truly a miracle. This is the kind of thing we're talking about with abundant manna. As Jesus is sharing the abundant manna and teaching the disciples to do the same, Jesus is always making sure that those who are the least and the lost and the outsiders are taken care of first and foremost, making sure that they're being looked after. Jesus is making sure that in the abundant manna, this food, the sustenance, basic necessities, all of the physical needs that need to be provided for, Jesus is making sure that those are being shared by those who have a lot and shared with those who have very little. So for those who have an abundance of manna, an abundance of food and things and possessions, Jesus tells them to give them away or sell them and use the money to help the poor, the lame, the blind, the widows, the children, the outcast, the sinners. And Jesus says to all these people who are on the outskirts, who are outcasts, who are ignored, that they belong at the table, and invite them to sit around the table with Jesus, with the disciples, and with everybody else. Jesus yet again is giving us example after example, story after story of how Jesus' abundant manna and mercy is for everybody, not just a select few, but for each and every person. And in this abundant manna and mercy, Jesus teaches us the Lord's Prayer, a prayer that we say every Sunday in worship together and other times throughout the week. The Lord's Prayer is a prayer that Jesus teaches the disciples. Jesus is teaching the disciples how to pray, because there were people at the time who would pray for attention instead of praying to talk to God. And so Jesus is teaching the disciples what a good way of praying looks like. In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus is inviting us to pray to Abba. Abba being a word, a nickname for a father, like dad or dada. And inviting us to have a close parent-child, healthy relationship with God. And Jesus in the Lord's Prayer is teaching us to pray for abundant manna and mercy for all. God's plan for the world to become full reality. The line, your kingdom come here on earth as it is in heaven. That's God's dream for God's kingdom or God's reign to be here on earth, just as it is in heaven, a place where everyone has abundant manna and mercy for all. In all of this teaching, Jesus is preparing the disciples for his eventual death, which he knows is coming soon, so that the disciples know how to bring about God's reign in the world without Jesus walking with them every day. Jesus is preparing the disciples because he knows that his death is coming, but the disciples aren't quite sure what that means yet. And Jesus wants them to be able to continue to do the work to bring God's kingdom or God's reign of abundant manna and mercy to the whole world after Jesus' death and resurrection into heaven. The same with each of us as we continue as Jesus' disciples today. Jesus gives us examples and stories and models of how we as disciples can bring about abundant manna and mercy in God's world today so that each and every person can have everything that they need and more to live their life and to live it abundantly. See you later.